When I was 10 years old, I accidentally stumbled upon an old doll in my grandmother's attic. My sister and I often spent time in that house, but on that day, the attic seemed unusually gloomy. This place always intrigued us. It was full of old boxes with toys, ancient books, abandoned items that once belonged to my grandmother. But on this day, everything was different. Even the light filtering through the dusty windows didn't seem as bright, and the air was heavy with the time that had frozen in this place. Everything around seemed to hold memories and secrets. Grandmother always said that the attic was not a place for playing. She often mentioned that there were many dangerous things stored up there. Things that could not only harm, but also bring misfortune. I never paid much attention to her words. I was curious about what was hidden in that mysterious place, and I couldn't resist going up there. On that day, I found myself alone in the attic, without my sister, and I saw the doll among other toys. At first glance, the doll didn't seem unusual. It looked like an ordinary old toy, but something in its eyes immediately unsettled me. They were too alive, glassy, deep, and dark. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Despite the strange feeling, I decided to take the doll and place it on the shelf in my room. But as soon as I touched it, it felt cold as ice. I quickly left it on the shelf and returned to my games. But the sensation was strange. It didn't look alive, but in its eyes, there seemed to be some hidden gaze following my every movement. I couldn't shake that feeling, but I still tried to forget it and continue with my games. A couple of days later, I went up to the attic again to find something else. That day, I looked at the doll again and noticed that its position had changed. At first, I didn't understand what happened and assumed that I simply didn't remember where I left it. However, the next day I found that it had moved again. It didn't seem like a coincidence anymore. I started to worry, and with each passing day, more strange things started happening. Soon I noticed that the doll was no longer on the shelf, but sitting on a chair. I couldn't explain how it got there, as I clearly remembered leaving it somewhere else. The oddities continued. On the third night, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt like someone was watching me. In the darkness, lit only by the faint light from the nightlight, I saw the doll sitting on the windowsill, its eyes staring directly at me. That was the moment when I realized that something was wrong with it. I was overwhelmed by fear, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. However, I couldn't forget that gaze, that coldness the doll seemed to transmit to me. I felt an inexplicable fear rising from within. I immediately ran to my grandmother and told her what was happening. She listened to me carefully, but she wasn't surprised. She quietly said, "You shouldn't have taken that doll." Her voice wasn't fearful, just tired, with a kind of hidden anxiety. Grandmother explained that this doll had been passed down through their family from generation to generation. It wasn't just a toy, but an amulet created to protect the home and family. But over the years, the spirit inside it had started to change. Grandmother warned me that if the doll stayed in the house for too long, the spirit would begin to watch over its owners and, at some point, could become dangerous. I felt horror when I realized I couldn't get rid of it. Grandmother advised me to burn it, but before doing so, I decided to leave it in the forest, far from the house, hoping it would never return. My sister and I took it to the woods and left it there, but the next morning I found it in my room. The doll was on the shelf, and its eyes were once again watching me. Fear overtook me, and I realized that this wasn't just a toy, but something much more, something alive. That night, after seeing the doll in my room, I understood that we couldn't avoid this curse. Grandmother said burning it would be dangerous, but at that moment I couldn't remain inactive. My sister and I burned it in the fireplace, hoping the spirit would leave. When the doll began to burn, I felt fear rising inside me. But at the moment when it completely disappeared into the fire, I heard a whisper. It sounded like my own voice. That was when I realized that the doll would never leave. It would haunt me. Many years have passed since then, but I still feel its gaze following me. Sometimes when I find old things or hear strange rustling sounds, it seems like it's close again. I can't get rid of this feeling, and I don't know if this spirit will ever leave, or if it will haunt me until the end of my days. My sister Christina has always been a passionate collector of antique toys. She started her collection in her teenage years when she began visiting antique shops and looking for rare dolls, teddy bears, and old cars that could complement her collection. She would go to flea markets and organize real treasure hunts, examining each toy like a researcher. In a way, I envied her passion, as antique toys didn't hold much meaning for me. But I was intrigued by her hobby, and sometimes I even accompanied her on her hunts. One day, she came home with a doll she had bought at a small antique shop on the outskirts of town. It was old, with a tattered dress and lips that seemed to never smile. I wasn't sure what was wrong with it, but I immediately felt that there was something unusual about this doll. Its glass eyes were too bright. They seemed to follow me wherever I went. It felt like it was alive, though that couldn't possibly be true. I was sure it was just my imagination, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that this doll wasn't just a toy. Christina immediately placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. At first, I thought it was just an old, worn-out doll with no particular value. But the longer I watched it, the more uncomfortable I became. I noticed the doll starting to move. At first, it was small shifts. Its eyes would slightly shift to the side, then its body seemed to turn. I thought maybe I was just not noticing the changes, or maybe Christina had accidentally moved it. But one day when I came into the room and saw the doll sitting on the windowsill, even though it had been in the shelf just moments before, I felt real unease. I decided to tell my sister about it, but she just laughed, dismissing my words as nonsense. She thought it was just my fear or imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this doll was more than just a toy. Every day, its behavior became stranger. Christina started noticing that it was moving too, but she still didn't take it seriously. One night, I woke up to a strange rustling sound. I got out of bed and went to Christina's room. When I entered, I froze. The doll was sitting on a chair, and its eyes were directed toward me. I stood still, not knowing what to do. In that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't normal. The fear grew stronger. I could feel that the doll was becoming more alive with each passing day, and its gaze was filled with some malevolent intent. Christina began to worry, but she still kept the doll in her room, thinking I was just imagining things. One night, I woke up to a quiet whisper. I got out of bed and slowly approached the door to her room. The whisper grew clearer, and when I peeked into the room, I saw the doll sitting by the window, and its lips were moving. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I approached closer, and in that moment, the doll said, "You won't be able to get rid of me." It wasn't just a whisper. These were clear, distinct words. I wanted to go to Christina and tell her, but I felt she would just laugh. I didn't know what to do. That night, I couldn't sleep, feeling that the doll was watching me. It was alive, and I didn't know how to rid myself of this terror. When I told Christina, she started taking it more seriously, but she still didn't want to part with the doll. She tried to convince me that it was just my fantasy, but I felt it was more than just a toy. It was something greater. We decided to find out where it came from. Soon I learned that the doll had been created for a ritual, to bind a spirit to it. We began searching for information and found that the doll had been part of a family tradition. It had been passed down through generations and was meant to protect the home from evil forces. But as it turned out, the doll didn't just serve as protection. Over time, its spirit became more sinister, and it began to manipulate its owners, turning into a real threat. I realized that if we didn't get rid of it, soon it would control us. We tried to get rid of it, but it kept coming back. We threw it into the forest, but the next morning we found it back in the room. Christina and I burned it, but the next morning it was back on the shelf again. It was watching us, and I couldn't understand how that was possible. We couldn't get rid of it. Grandmother told us that the doll was part of an ancient ritual tied to a curse. We could no longer stay in the house with this horror. In the end, we burned it again, and this time its eyes truly dimmed. But every day I felt like its spirit was still somewhere nearby. Sometimes I feel its presence, and I think it will always be with us. We couldn't escape its curse. I've always been a fan of adventures, especially those that involve abandoned places. When I was 18, I decided to visit one of those places that had always intrigued me, an abandoned toy factory on the outskirts of town. I found some information about it online. No one remembered when it closed, but according to rumors, the building was quite old, and inside, there were many toys that had been made decades ago. I loved these kinds of places, their ruined atmosphere, the reminders of the past hidden in dusty corners and forgotten objects. The toy factory seemed like the perfect place to explore. I didn't go there alone. I invited two of my friends, Jason and Mike. We were all fans of abandoned buildings, and for us it was a real challenge. We packed our backpacks with necessary items, flashlights, cameras, and notebooks to document our experience. We decided it would be a fun adventure that we'd remember when we were older. But I was wrong. When we arrived, the building looked just like I had imagined. A huge, empty factory covered in graffiti, with collapsed walls and broken windows. The factory was in an industrial area, and no living creature seemed to have access to this place. I felt a little uneasy as we got closer, but we continued moving forward. We sneaked through a locked door, and it turned out we had gotten inside. The factory was so destroyed that in some places we had to climb over debris. The spirit of old, long-forgotten times filled the space. I noticed how in the dark corners, old toys that had once been made there were still scattered about. Broken dolls, bears, cars that had lost their shine and were now covered in dust. As we wandered around the factory, I kept feeling that something strange was happening in this place. The toys looked like they were watching us. Their glassy eyes were fixed on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were alive. We explored further, and soon we found ourselves in a large workshop. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the workshop stood a huge doll, made from parts of other toys. It was creepy. The head was made from one doll, the torso from another, and the arms and legs from various other toy parts. It was bigger than a normal doll, and its eyes seemed enormous and absolutely alive. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just a feeling. I thought this doll was waiting for something invisible but no less dangerous. Jason and Mike, standing next to me, seemed unfazed, as always. They were examining the details of the doll, admiring its strange yet skillfully made appearance. But I couldn't take my eyes off its gaze. At first I thought it was an illusion, but then I realized that the eyes were really moving, like they were following every step I took. Mike noticed that the doll was slightly swaying, even though there was no wind in the room. That made us freeze. Everything around grew quieter. We could only hear our footsteps and the sound of our breathing. I felt panic building inside me. We decided to approach the doll closer, but the closer we got, the more tense the atmosphere became. I didn't know which scared me more, the doll itself or what was happening around us. Suddenly there was a sound, like rustling, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. We froze. Mike turned on his flashlight, and we began to look around. Shadows started forming in the darkness, strange outlines. Everything seemed unnatural. It felt like we had disturbed something that was meant to stay hidden. We heard strange sounds like light footsteps or creaking, but there was nothing around us. Unable to endure the tension any longer, we decided to leave the factory. But as soon as we turned around, the door we came through slammed shut with a loud crack. We desperately tried to open it, but it was useless. Panic was rising, and at that moment, the doll in the center of the room began to move. Its head slowly turned in our direction, and its eyes were filled with ominous forewarning. That was the moment I realized we had become part of something horrifying. Jason suggested trying to escape through the window, but when we approached it, we found that the glass was gone, and in its place was a dark, black curtain. We were trapped. We were in this place, and it wasn't going to let us go. Suddenly, another silhouette emerged from the shadows, a huge shadow, and we heard a terrifying, almost inhuman sound, like something very heavy being dragged across the floor. I felt my legs go weak, and my heart skipped a beat. We ran again, trying to escape the factory. We jumped into the car and drove off without looking back. When we returned to the city, Jason said he noticed how, in one of the corridors, there were marks on the floor, as if someone or something had been crawling behind us, leaving heavy imprints. We tried to forget about that place, but I felt that it wouldn't let us go. Those toys were not just lifeless objects, but something far more sinister. It was part of something that should never have been disturbed. Years have passed, but I still hear rustling sounds in the dark, and sometimes I feel like those eyes are watching me again from the shadows. At that moment, we didn't realize what we had encountered, but now I understand. We should have left, but we didn't. And now that factory, those toys, and that horror will haunt us forever. When I was a child, my family and I moved around a lot. My father was in the military, and his job required frequent relocations. We lived in different cities, in different houses, but there is one house I will never forget. It was in a small town up north, where it seemed like time had stopped. The houses there were old, covered with moss and lichen, and the air was unusually fresh and crisp. We settled into a large house with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked underfoot. It was unusual, and something about it immediately drew my attention. My mother often said it was a house with history, while my father simply liked it for its spaciousness and old style. As for me, I noticed that I felt uneasy there. From the very first day we moved in, I felt something strange. My new house was old, and despite its grandeur and beauty, there was a sense of emptiness and silence that felt somehow oppressive. What troubled me the most was one particular place, a large antique mirror archway in the hallway. This mirror was so huge that it covered an entire wall. It wasn't just old. It had strange, barely noticeable cracks along its edges, and when I looked into it, it felt like there was someone behind me. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but every day I felt like the mirror was becoming more alive. Its surface didn't just reflect me, but something else. A shadow that didn't belong to me. I often stood in front of this mirror and couldn't tear my eyes away. Sometimes I saw my movements reflected with a slight delay, as if someone else was there, watching me. One day, I noticed that when I left the room, a shadow remained in the mirror, standing in the same spot where I had just been. When I returned, the shadow would disappear. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my hand casting a shadow, but the inner fear still wouldn't leave me. One night, when I was lying in bed, I heard a strange sound. At first it was barely audible, as if someone was quietly walking through the house. I got up from my bed and went to check. All the rooms were dark, and only the light from the hallway faintly illuminated the way. I approached the mirror and noticed that it seemed to darken slightly. Then, I saw her. In the reflection, on that same shadow, a figure appeared. A woman with long hair, dressed in an old dress. She stood perfectly still, like a statue. I rose, unable to move. I knew no one was in the room and that I was the only one in the house, but this figure seemed too real to be just a reflection. I watched as her eyes, though they seemed empty, began to move, following every step I took. I felt a chill run through my body. Unable to move, I stood there watching her. She was still as ever, but her presence felt real, almost too real. I couldn't understand why I was so afraid. I turned away from the mirror, my heart racing. I knew I had to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The air in the room felt cold, as if it had thickened. I thought about calling out, but no words would come. I finally fled from the room. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It felt like the mirror had become a window to another world, one where this woman existed. I wasn't sure if it was a dream, but I couldn't escape the feeling that she was still there, watching me. I tried to tell my parents, but they brushed it off. They thought it was just my childhood imagination, that I was probably scared of something else. But I knew what I had seen. I decided to avoid the mirror, not to go near it. However, each day the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, I couldn't resist anymore. I went back to the mirror and looked into it, despite the fear. At that moment, I saw the woman in the reflection step forward. Her eyes glowed with a strange light. I stepped back, terrified. I looked away, and when I returned to the mirror, Everything was as it was before. No woman, no shadow, no signs of what had just occurred. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a nightmare, or maybe I was just going insane. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden in that mirror. I avoided it, stayed away from that place. But sometimes, even now, I feel like she's still there, watching.